Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, May 3rd, 2020, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 2020 electoral map and how Donald Trump can achieve an electoral college landslide. So when we look at the modern political scale or the electoral map, there is no possibility that any of these candidates get a Ronald Reagan or Richard Nixon or FDR type landslide. Realistically, a landslide in the modern political stage is 350 electoral votes or more. For right now, America is extremely polarized and will likely remain that way for decades to come. And unfortunately for both political parties, they likely will not carry certain states for 50 years from now on. I mean, there's never going to be a super big majority for either side. If this election proved anything, that regardless of what may happen on both political sides, major mistakes do not have a huge play on the general election. And 2016 proved that. And, honestly, 2012 was probably the last year that we had a normal type presidential election. Realistically, moving on, things are going to be dealt with a lot differently. So Donald Trump's pathway wouldn't be super difficult. By the way, when I am going to characterize these states, if a state is expected to go to Donald Trump, I will keep it within that margin that I expect it to go for Donald Trump. So, for example, if Michigan was to go to Donald Trump, and it definitely would be crucial if he was going to win with a majority, with a landslide, I'm not going to characterize it as likely. This is not his best case scenario. This is purely based off of where he can flip and what type of electoral college landslide we would see. And for a number of these states, they're not going to be adjusted. Just because Florida and Arizona and Wisconsin are going to Donald Trump does not mean that I'm going to make Ohio and Iowa any more red than what I expect them to be in the presidential election. These will all be based off if Donald Trump individually focused attention to these states, what is the margin it would flip by? And that's how I'm going to keep the remainder of these states. The same thing I did in my Joe Biden video. If you haven't checked it out, it's a Joe Biden pathway to an electoral college landslide. Same thing I'm doing for this prediction as well. You'll see once the map starts filling in. But let's go ahead and characterize all of the safe states. Pretty much how they're going to be. Realistically, these safe states don't matter if I consider them to be likely or safe or not. I'm not going to be super cautious as to the safe states and how I characterize them. But let's just go ahead and just characterize all of the safe Democratic states. These are states that Donald Trump is not going to get close to winning in, mainly because they are just so solid for the Democratic Party, the same way that these Republican states are so solid. Again, Donald Trump will never carry the state of Maryland, and Joe Biden will never carry the state of South Dakota. These are states that are ingrained in through their statewide policies and their electorate, either Democratic or Republican states, and no type of super enthusiastic candidate could change that. Regardless of popularity and support from both sides, realistically, Joe Biden is not going to carry certain states, and Donald Trump will not carry some of those other states. So I'm just going to go ahead and fill in actually all of these. You know what? I'm just going to consider them safe right now because it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Maine's 1st district would be considered safe. So this is the 241 electoral votes map that pretty much the candidates are looking at. They don't really care about all of these safe states. Yes, they'll visit it once for a $2,000 a plate dinner for a fundraiser, but they're realistically not going to care about it in the general election. When we look at the overall electoral map, Donald Trump won a number of these states in 2016. Arizona, Texas, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Indiana. I don't know why Indiana's there. Geez. Ohio, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Maine 2nd district. But he's going to need a little bit more than that because he only got 306 electoral votes in 2016. So where can he actually get that? Well, when you look at this map, it's going to be really hard, because Donald Trump has alienated a lot of these voters in certain states to a point where even if he was to try to get an electoral college landslide, some of these states are realistically not going to be flipping. Donald Trump is not going to be able to carry any of these safe states. And maybe we're talking about a best case scenario. He could narrow them down, but they're not flipping. New Jersey's not flipping. Oregon's not flipping, and those are probably one of the closer states in terms of overall percentages. When I say closer, I mean 16-17% in favor of the Democrats. Let's start with the easy states, though. We know Texas is going to go to Donald Trump. We know Georgia is likely to go to Donald Trump, North Carolina as well. Recently, I mean tilt, but it's still going to go to Donald Trump. Florida as well, that one goes to Donald Trump. These are states that are pretty simple to figure out, considering that Ohio and Iowa were pretty solid for him in 2016. I mean, obviously they would be crucial if he was to have a landslide victory, and then he would have to win through the Rust Belt, which wouldn't be the hardest scenario for him. If he was to win in these states, honestly, it would be less than 1% yet again, because that's how close it was in 2016. He hasn't gained any new voters, and if he was to keep the state in his column, it's going to be insanely close. The only state that realistically I could see Donald Trump doing well in is the state of Wisconsin out of those 3 states, but again, they all would be less than 1%. But Donald Trump obviously is reelected by this margin. He doesn't really have to worry about winning an electoral college landslide unless we're talking about a mandate as he goes through into office for the next 4 years. But Minnesota's within striking distance. It was decided by a 1 to 2%, I think less than 2% margin in 2016 against Hillary Clinton. The only thing that helped Hillary Clinton here was, I guess, the older vote and obviously the big cities. Other than that, I mean, it's Trump country. That's pretty much how every state goes outside of the urban centers. Donald Trump does very well in, except for some of those suburban areas that have flipped to the Democrats. But Minnesota, again, is well within striking distance, but if it was to flip, it would be a very small margin. As for New Hampshire, I mean, this one has gotten completely out of the reach of the president. If he was to win here, which there is always a scenario because it is a swing state and this is a general election, but realistically, Joe Biden probably has a 95 to 5% chance for Joe Biden to Donald Trump's chances in the state of New Hampshire. The comments he's made about the state in the past and its newfound Democratic presence, solid Democratic presence, hasn't and isn't going to go well for Donald Trump in the general election. New Hampshire was very close in 2016, but it's probably not going to be as close in 2020. Joe Biden is probably going to do very well in the state of New Hampshire. As we look across to the West Coast, Nevada and Colorado, these are 2 states that I consider to be likely Democratic states on the presidential level. Donald Trump has, again, alienated a number of these voters in these states to a point, again, if he was to win here, it would be insanely close. These are no longer states that are entirely in play. Hillary Clinton carried them, Barack Obama carried them, and Joe Biden is likely to carry them as well. Though Joe Biden didn't win either of those 2, I think Colorado may have had a caucus, but either of those 2 Democratic primary elections, that's really not going to matter in the grand scheme of things. These definitely took a way more Democratic term in the midterm elections, and they also didn't go to Donald Trump in 2016, so they would have to be super close if Donald Trump was to escape with a victory there against Joe Biden. Now, up in the Northeast, it wouldn't be hard for him to carry Maine's 2nd district. It would go to him probably by a likely margin if he was to keep on to the same base that he had before, with the exception of some of them going back to the Democratic side. As for Arizona, again, this is a state that Donald Trump, I think, if the Democrats fail to focus on it well, it could be very similar to the 2016 margin. I think that the Democrats have a lean characterization right now in the state of Arizona, but Donald Trump definitely has a Republican presence there that, if neglected by the Democrats the same way the Rust Belt was in 2016, honestly, it will revert back to its, I guess you could say, roots or Republican identity that it's had in the past in presidential elections. Nebraska's 2nd district shouldn't be too hard to capture for the president. He's likely to get it anyway in the general election. Maine at large would have to go to Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton carried Maine at large by 2 to 3%. Maine's 1st district by, I think, around 10%, and then Donald Trump carried Maine's 2nd district by an even larger margin. It was a huge flip from Obama to Trump, so it should be pretty solid for Donald Trump in Maine's 2nd district, but Maine at large would have to be a little bit more in favor of him in terms of to win the overall at large state. So that's 3 out of the 4 electoral votes from the state of Maine. So Donald Trump's actually pathway to an overall electoral college landslide is very, very slim. We have to go through the final 2 states of Virginia and New Mexico. And both of these states are more likely than not going to go for Donald Trump. We're talking about him probably having 3 to 5% chance of winning either of these 2 states in the general election. He's probably not going to focus on it, and Virginia would honestly just be a waste of time. These are 2 states that have definitely shown their Democratic presence in both the midterm elections, special elections, off-year elections, and the 2016 presidential election. Everything is showing that approval rating polls too, and handling of the coronavirus situations too, they aren't going to go well for Donald Trump in the 2020 election. But if there was a state to go over the other, I would say Virginia's a little bit and a tad bit more in play than the state of New Mexico. Realistically, Donald Trump probably won't carry the state of New Mexico. Virginia is definitely a little bit more in play. I'm characterizing New Mexico as likely because that's how I expect it to go in the general election with Joe Biden as the nominee. I'm not going to narrow it up just because Donald Trump's winning in other states. This is what I meant by just keeping it within the same margin if the states were to flip. But you see a lot of tilt states on here. 134 electoral votes have led Donald Trump to victory, but these are all tilt margins. This shows you, number one, how grim his chances are at the presidential election, number one. But number two, how these states would have to be extremely narrow and would barely flip from the Democratic column. Virginia realistically is going to go to the Democrats in the presidential election, but if I had to decide between New Mexico and Virginia, Virginia would be the one to go. When you look at this electoral map, Donald Trump barely breaks that electoral college landslide mark. 350 electoral votes to Joe Biden's 188. That's comparable, I guess you could say, to Obama's 2008 victory if you applied it to the 2010 census data or the 2020 electoral map. I think it's just off by 5 or 6, or I think actually 8 electoral votes. But it's still around the same margin. So if this was the 2020 map, and by no means is this a likely 2020 map, Donald Trump would have an extreme mandate. If you look at these states and you characterize them from red and blue, and you take out the margins, it looks a lot more redder, and it looks like pretty much a sea of red. Actually, I'm just going to do that for the sake of visuals because it looks insane when you look at all of these states and you make them solid red, because then you actually see the true effect of the Republican wave in this scenario, because it's a lot more realistic if you do that, because that's what the media will be playing, the entire country will see. And this is what it would look like. So again, a sea of red. The margins matter, but not so much that they will change the overall electoral vote numbers. But again, this is Donald Trump's pathway to an electoral college landslide. So tonight I'm going to probably send out a Senate video. I'm not sure. I was thinking New Hampshire Senate race, but that one honestly isn't too important. The remaining realistic states that I probably should cover are Iowa, Georgia, and Georgia special election, and Texas. The rest of them are probably going to end up being likely, if not safe, but I definitely will cover them at some point, but they're not my main priority. Make sure to comment down which one you'd like to see out of those 4. It really all depends on what I can get to, but I would love to do a Senate video tonight. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you all tomorrow.